जब छोड़ चले लखनऊ नगरी, कहे हाल के दिल पे क्या गुजरी. These very words were said by Amjad Khan in Shatranj Ke Khilari by Satyajit Ray. Now, if you must be wondering why am I speaking the same lines to you, because today we are standing outside the Sibtainabad Imambara, which is the mausoleum of the last king of Awadh, Nawab Wajid Ali Shah. Today's guest on Indulge videos is Soumyadeep Roy, a visual artist who through his practice has been resurrecting the times of the Nawab that he had spent here in Calcutta. We will speak to him more about his creative process, about resurrecting this space, and also how he connects it with today's audience almost 160 years later. Come. Hi Soumyadeep.
Hi Subhadrika.
And welcome to Indulge videos. First and foremost, tell me what made you have Wajid Ali Shah as your creative muse.
So the journey started long back in 2017, much further back, but like concretely in 2017 when I was working with the city's history, Kolkata's history, and I was interested in how the city is actually made of bubbles, of how different communities have come and like rebuilt the city into like little bubbles which make up the entire city. And Metiabruz is sort of like the best example of that because it is a very conscious recreation of another city of Lucknow. So that is where it started. Initially, my idea was that I would be working on the people who migrated with Wajid Ali Shah rather than Wajid Ali Shah himself. But then I sort of, once I started on the research and once I started work on the history of this period, it became very obvious how influential this one figure was and how Wajid Ali Shah himself sort of becomes sort of like the center point of all that's happening. And that's how I started reading up on him and then about his life, which is incredibly fascinating. And that is how then I got interested in his life itself and how all the challenges that he faced and all the adversities that he faced, he sort of turned them around in a way, and he still continued to do what he loved to do. And he's not just an ordinary king who sort of ruled a kingdom, but he was so much more. He was also an artist, and again, it's sort of unfair to limit him to just as an artist or as a king. If you limit him as a king, you don't see his vision as an artist, and if you only see him as a king, you also limit his prowess as an administrator, which he successfully managed an entire kingdom both in Lucknow and then in Metiabruz.
Right.
So then how this one singular man lives so many lives together. So I found that very fascinating, and as an artist it was very interesting to see how it's not just one singular path that you have as an artist, and all of your experiences in life, they sort of inform what you make then as an artist, your own art.
Right. But the Metiabruz that you talk about, Wajid Ali Shah's Metiabruz, that existed almost 150-60 years ago from today.
Yes.
So, I'm sure it must have been very challenging to recreate that entire phase. Could you take us through your process?
So, of course, from the start itself, it was very obvious that it would not be possible to have an exact recreation of what it was 160, 100 and almost 160 years ago, when this place, for example, this Imambara itself is being built 160 years ago. The entire map of not just the city, but the entire country and the entire subcontinent would have been different. People would have had very different lives. People would have had very different mindscapes. And to imagine that in the present in 2024 is almost next to impossible. So my idea was to then go back to these primary sources, see what do the people who lived in these times they speak about. So an obvious start was Abdul Halim Sharar's writings on Lucknow, who would have seen this with his own eyes as a child, as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old child. and his recollections. So that was a starting point. And then, of course, from that to Wajid Ali Shah's own writings, like the way he writes in Ishqnama, his own, like literally in his own words, how he describes his life and how he sees himself. And that gives you an insight, like that almost, it's, I think, one of those unique pieces of literature which is so candid that a king writes about his love life. And of all things he could have written about, like so many people have written about war, he writes about love. And I think that sort of, immediately makes it very unique. And that was another way of trying to find him through his own writing, through the writings of people around him, and of course a lot of other writings which sort of come around the times that were that this were. And then again, my idea was to sort of connect it to the present. So I was largely working with the people whose families continue to still remain in Metiabruz. So one person who I was very close to, whose shop was right a few meters away from this Imambara, his pawn shop, was Dr. Ramesh Kumar Saini. So he was a homeopathic doctor who also ran his pawn shop, which was opened by his ancestor, and whose ancestor was the Shahi Panwala of Wajid Ali Shah's time.
Right.
So that pawn shop sort of, like once the court was it sort of disintegrated after his death, he opened a pawn shop right here in Metiabruz, and that was continued for 5 generations by this person. So I shot there. I made a documentary of his shop and another shop in Lucknow as sort of like this documentary called Gilori, which was like a 12-hour video of these 2 different shops. And from him, it was very interesting to learn as to how this history lives on. And a lot of people I've met here in Metiabruz, like, in these lanes itself, whose ancestors have had come from Lucknow or around Lucknow all these years ago, 160 years ago, and they still continue to see Lucknow as their home. But at the same time, they also see Kolkata as their home. So this whole duality between what is home, which is also the case with Wajid Ali Shah himself, then, like, because he resettles here. So that is something that fascinates me, and that is what I wanted to get into, as to a lot of oral histories which are lost. There are a lot of colonial narratives on this period, but then the problem with the colonial narratives, which are still, say, written by a lot of Western authors, is that they bank on the propaganda machinery that was started in the 19th century against Wajid Ali Shah, against, like, which sort of, solidified their motion towards the annexation, because it was sort of an illegal annexation, which they had to justify with a lot of literature. So then these sources I have, of course, been through, but now I try to avoid them, because then it sort of gives you a very unclear picture of the times. And also at the same time, a lot of the literature that comes a little later, they valorize maybe the times differently from what it was. I mean, if you really read the literature of the times, you actually then get an idea of what it really was, for with all its glory. You don't need to, like, valorize it anymore for how unique it really was. So these were like the different sources. And a lot of art, a lot of music has informed my practice and my research, because music lives on. So the performers who still sing, they've learned it through the Guru Shishya Parampara, and they would have continued this whole oral history in a way through art. So that has been mostly my research.
Right. And now, before I move on to my next question, I would just like to inform that today we are sitting at the historic Sibtainabad Imambara, which happens to be the mausoleum of Wajid Ali Shah. So, tell me about this place, and how does this particular location have a very important impact in your career as a creative artist?
So one of the most exciting things in Metiabruz was to see all the remnants that continue to remain. And the thing is, from about, say, I've been visiting here maybe since 2015, 2016, and in the last almost 10 years now, 9 years, 10 years, it has changed so much. Even in 2017, even in 2018, this very shop of Dr. Ramesh Kumar Saini, where I was shooting, that shop is no more. That building itself is no more. And a lot has changed around the area. And especially within the lanes, So then it just feels like a treasure hunt of sorts, that, like, in the middle of all this concrete, you suddenly find this beautiful stucco work which remains from 160 years ago. So in that case, this Imambara is like the most concrete evidence almost of the times that it was. So and also, like, I've also been doing heritage walks here, and I've been attending heritage walks by Sheikh Sohail. So he, again, like, when we come here, when we actually, both of us actually end our walk here in this very place, because there's a sense of wonderment about not just the size of the place, but also the fact that he himself is resting here. And then you have these beautiful chandeliers, and the intricacies that sort of carry on from Lucknow to Kolkata, that sort of remain here.
Right.
So then it's sort of very inspiring. It sort of gives you an idea of what it could have been, and you can almost imagine that maybe you are in Lucknow in a way.
But creatively also, in about 160 years, you were the first artist to have an exhibition here.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So that was an honor completely thanks to the family, thanks to Manzilat Fatima, thanks to Dr. Talat Fatima, and of course Kamran Meerza. So it's all of them who've made it possible, because otherwise this was unthinkable to have an exhibition in a place like this, and they've supported me throughout. Kamran Bhai took care of literally every little problem I would have faced here while I painted the scroll here, or even now while I continue to, continue with my research, with my work. And everyone at the Imambara, everyone actually have always come forward to help. We had issues of putting up the scroll here, and it was a long scroll, a heavy scroll. And then again, like, the people at the Imambara, we almost came together as a team, and it seemed like, like a joint effort, and sort of makes you recollect of the different plays that Wajid Ali Shah would put together with his large team, and then, like, sort of, how then it all sort of comes together for the final result in a way. So it has, and again, I've never been very fond as an artist, as a visual artist. I've never been very fond of white cube spaces, because the moment you have galleries, I do exhibit at galleries, I do exhibit at white cube spaces, but I also do feel that it sort of cuts off the general public, because it sort of creates this environment of intimidation in a way, where only people related to the arts come and see the artworks. Whereas I would prefer a place like this, which is so contextually relevant for my work, because for me, more than an exhibition, it was more like a gift for the king. So I wanted to, there's this idea that the fact that his body and his soul are also resting at the tomb is this idea of how the body and the soul would rest at these respective tombs until the day of judgment, until the day of Qiyamah, when all of them would rise together. So right now, one can imagine that Wajid Ali Shah is resting in this tomb. So the idea was that, like, I am painting it to him as a performance, and someone who's very fond of the arts of performance. It's sort of like a tribute to him, to the king, and anyone who comes to see the exhibition is sort of like an onlooker, like it would be so in a court where the presentation is happening to the king, and then, like, people who come are also seeing it, like, sort of like an eavesdropping of the performance in a way. So
Right.
that was the idea.
Right. As you said that Wajid Ali Shah still has descendants in the city,
Yes.
and they have been very supportive of your work.
Yeah.
So tell me, how do they perceive of your initiative of reviving the Nawab?
I think they would be the best to say it, but right now, like, I think I feel very close to them, and again, like, I think over the years, the bond has become only stronger, and we have had several other programs which started like around 2018ish, and those sort of helped us also think about like how Wajid Ali Shah is popularly perceived, because there are a lot of misconceptions about the king still, and they continue in the popular realm, and you continue with, like, the age of WhatsApp forwards, you continue with a lot of misinformation. So our idea has been to sort of navigate that, and right here in this very place, Dr. Talat Fatima had said something very beautiful on the opening of the exhibition. she had mentioned how maybe the soul of Wajid Ali Shah continues in me, which felt like the greatest honor that it could be.
Right.
And she also said that, like, if he was alive, he would have maybe maybe definitely uh, supported like endeavors like this, like that we attempt at.
Right. Let's move a little bit towards your process of creativity.
Right.
Since you identify as a visual artist, and art itself is a visual medium,
Right.
so what separates or distinguishes your specification of art or your genre of art from what we know as art?
Right. So I am a visual artist primarily. I work with the visual medium because that is primarily the medium I work with painting, with installations, with video, drawing. But I also do feel that art cannot be isolated. So I feel that, like, especially in the subcontinent, there is this long tradition of the arts being interconnected. So if you have a painting, you also have a song for it, like with Potachitro, or with even with say Wajid Ali Shah's period, or a little prior to that, even in the Darbari courts, you would have a music that sort of is in dialogue with the visual arts. So none of them stand alone. Similarly, like this Imambara itself, it would not stand alone just as a structure. It's just not a piece of architecture. It's also a culmination of the different arts which sort of surround it. Like, say, for example, fashion. Say, for example, the designs of chicken curry that sort of then turn, and then they become a part of the gate. And similarly, the fish continues from like paintings to the emblem to the performances of the Parikhana, and they become again the emblems of Wajid Ali Shah, of the angel and mermaid fish. Similarly, I feel that like all arts, especially in the subcontinent tradition, are connected. So that informs me, and I was trained as a classical musician in Dhrupad, in Vishnupur Gharana under Pandit Bhavani Shankar Mazumdar. So from a very young age, so it also sort of helped me perceive visual arts in a certain way. So I see drawing almost as riyaz, as a continuation of that practice. And again, I was trained in literature and film, and these trainings sort of come together for me, and I can't see them as separate, as just like a painting hanging at a gallery for me feels dead in a way. I'd rather have a song or a story that connects it to the visual. So that's how I see it. But for me, again, the medium at the end of the day comes down primarily to the visuals, because that is the medium I feel the most comfortable in. But it's in like a sort of collaboration with the other mediums.
Right. So, what is your creative process now? How does it look like? Is there any particular time of the day that you think you are, creatively more, energized to produce artworks or something?
So I feel like I forget who mentioned this, but I think maybe Picasso or someone had mentioned that, like, inspiration does not come to you unless you're actually working. So I have been drawing, like I said, like Riyaz. So for me, it has been like I have a small drawing pad which I carry literally everywhere. I travel a lot, so wherever I go, I always have my drawing book with me, and it's sort of like seeing it through my drawings in a way. And there is this beautiful Merleau-Ponty essay on Cézanne's practice, where like the hand and the mind sort of become indistinct at a point. So for me, it has become that. At an earlier point, it was like I would make studies of things, and then I would later sort of recreate them into artworks. But for me now, slowly the lines are blurring. So as I see them, they sort of come in what I believe to be my language, and that's how what I attempt at, as to like see them and visualize them, and almost like you can't actually stop your mind from thinking.
Right.
So for me, it comes a lot during travel, in transit. So if I'm going from one place to another, it invigorates me, and I love to be outside. I love to walk around. I love to walk a lot, and to see things, and that comes as an inspiration for me. So I keep drawing, and I keep thinking about things, and then again, it's sort of like somewhere at the back of your head, you sort of keep these archives of memories that you see of the everyday, and then maybe I revisit them and then reconstruct them in a certain way.
Right. As you were mentioning that you love to travel,
Yeah.
I'm sure during your research on Wajid Ali Shah, your research took you to Lucknow.
Yes.
So, how is the Nawab perceived in his homeland and in Calcutta?
That's actually a brilliant question, because I think very few people actually talk about this, but I think the two ways of perceiving Wajid Ali Shah are completely different in Lucknow and Kolkata. I think for primarily for people in Lucknow, Wajid Ali Shah was their last Nawab, their last king, and for people in Kolkata, Wajid Ali Shah in a way was sort of like the first major king that we had in the city. All the other kings we've had mostly were titular kings or ones who were sort of visiting, like temporarily visiting. No one like sort of came from as large a kingdom as Awadh, like Wajid Ali Shah did, and very few people actually stayed for such a long span of 3 decades and more, as Wajid Ali Shah did in Kolkata. Of course, you have those popular perceptions of him being perceived as only being the one who brings aloo to biryani, and those cliches of
I was
how
about to come to that, but you came to that before
yeah,
me.
so those are the cliches that you sort of the general perception in Kolkata. But then again, people who are like seriously researching on him, like Dr. Sudipta Mitra, and of course the phenomenal Dr. The late Dr. Kamran Meerza, who was also the descendant of Wajid Ali Shah, and they of course went into the depths of his life in Metiabruz. And one great advantage of working on Wajid Ali Shah's life is that he has written so much. He was a prolific writer, so there's a lot of literature on him. So in Kolkata, people who work with primary sources work with his life, like Husne Akhtar, where he mentions his life in at the Fort William, the 2 years sort of he was in lockdown, sort of in house arrest. Those years, and then his later years, how he rebuilds the kingdom here. So those sources, but right now I feel like very few people refer to these primary sources. A lot of people from Calcutta, owing to their affinity to the English language and Bangla language, of course, they sort of again fall back on the Western narratives, which again changes the perception of how you see the king, because you are not reading directly from his writing or people writing during his period. Whereas in Lucknow, people who are seriously researching on him, again you have these popular perceptions about Wajid Ali Shah, all these untruths, sort of misinformed stories about Wajid Ali Shah, which are very spicy, which are very interesting, but not all of them are correct always. So you have again that similarly in Lucknow as a parallel, you have these popular misconceptions, but again you have these serious researchers who are not only working on the period itself, on 19th century Lucknow and 18th century Lucknow, but ones who are actually going into the primary sources. You have serious researchers like Dr. Roshan Taki, who's reading his Persian literature, reading his Urdu literature, and referring to their primary sources. So these sources sort of become it makes it more real. But then again, the perception in both these cases are like you see as as like a Kolkata Wajid Ali Shah and a Lucknow Wajid Ali Shah, and none of them are lesser than each other, because he's almost symmetrically spent his lives in two halves in these two places.
Right. So what is your biggest takeaway since you've given so much time and so much creative efforts in
Right.
researching and understanding the Nawab? So, creatively, what is your biggest takeaway from this entire process, which is still continuing, in fact?
So for me, I mean, I could have stopped it at the grant itself, which I got in 2017, and that could have been the end of the journey. But I don't know why I was really attracted to this history, to this time, and I've independently been carrying this out for the last 7 years. And I think the reason itself is that it has a sense of it gives you a sense of introspection into what you how you see life, because here was an artist who lived so long ago, literally born more than 200 years ago, and yet his influences continue into the present, into the very popular present, who continues to live in the minds of so many people. And that, as a fellow artist, in a way, you start to sort of think as to, like, what this great artist could have done, and then you sort of start to introspect on your own practice. And for me, it has been mostly that it sort of gives me an inspiration into looking at my own art, and into seeing myself in perspective of the past.
Right. Hypothetically, if you happen to meet Wajid Ali Shah,
Yeah.
what would you like to tell him?
uh, this is that's actually a really great question, fun question. I would maybe we would probably listen to music together, or maybe look at paintings together, and share our likes and dislikes, and we'd be like, this is not that great, or this singer missed the beat, or maybe something along those lines. But also, I'd be very interested to see how Wajid Ali Shah would perceive cinema, because as a student of film, you also see his influence on present day Indian cinema, because it has largely affected the way Indian cinema is made even right now. And you still have his riddles, some of his songs in current day films. So I would really love to see how he saw those films, and definitely he'd want to make films. So then, how he makes films and what films would he make? So that's something I would be very interested in, and maybe collaborate with him on making these films.
How do you use art, your creativity, and your creative process
Yeah.
as a way of preserving Calcutta's heritage?
The thing is, when you're especially in a city like Calcutta, and as I mentioned, even here, like, so much has changed in the last 9 years alone, and so much more even before. So the thing about when you actually love the history and heritage of a city like Kolkata, you feel anxious about all that's going away, and you actually see these little things sort of wither away, like, the tram being stopped, for example, like, the biggest example right now, or these buildings that maybe you see like day after day for years, and then suddenly vanishes and becomes like a square flat. And people, for the longest time, people who share stories of the past, of who knew the city so very well, when they pass away, and these stories sort of, in a way, stop with them and their way of telling. And that sort of makes you anxious as to how you can sort of still preserve them. And archives can only do so much, but stories and art, they live on. And again, Wajid Ali Shah is the biggest example. The fact that his memory survives is because he was an artist and his art survives. Similar to almost all the great artists of like every age, like, their times have sort of lived on through their artworks. Whether it be Shakespeare, whether it be Tagore, you learn about the times almost through their work. It becomes an anchor. So, as an artist, I feel it's a great privilege, and so for me, I personally feel very interested in history itself. So, I feel it's amazing to be able to make art in tribute of this history, which sort of also carries on into the future. So in a way, you're standing in the present, connecting both the past and the future together.
Right.
So that, I think, is the greatest privilege as an artist.
Right. And as we come to the end of this conversation, I will ask you, you are supposed to be having a very interesting exhibition. And in that exhibition also, Wajid Ali Shah has made a mark.
Yes.
So tell me about that exhibition.
So while researching on Wajid Ali Shah for the last 7 years, I was, of course, like, not researching on his times alone, but going further back to the 18th century, to also the 17th century, of, like, his ancestors who come from Nishapur, and how they come to Bengal also at a certain earlier point. They come to then later in Delhi and throughout the subcontinent, like, their times in the subcontinent. And then, of course, the whole Awadh lineage, the kings, the Nawabs of Awadh, their histories. And while looking into their histories and looking into the family history of Wajid Ali Shah, I suddenly remembered that there was a book that I had received from a relative of mine, a grand uncle of mine, who had gifted this book from the 1960s, which traces my family. So then I got into rereading this book rather. I'd read it as a child, like like almost years ago, several years ago when he had visited the last time. And then the book was there in some corner, and the biggest challenge was to find that book. And then once I started reading that book, it was a book from the 1960s written by someone who was not from our family. So it again gives you like an objective history into objective view of the history of the family. So then I started tracing my family, and then I traced it till about almost the 12th century, going by the references of the book from the book itself. The book primarily emphasizes on the 16th till about the 20th century, but it has references which help me to get back till about the 12th century. So I have till about maybe 25 generations and almost 14 generations unbroken. So that gave me a perspective as to how much my family itself had traveled. And like all the prospective places, what you imagine your family to be is so different from what it is. So that is what I'm working on this family history and all these different stories that I came across during this research, which I started almost right after this exhibition here in at the Sibtainabad Imambara. So almost about like a year and a half and a year of solid research into this, and that sort of is what what I'm working on, as to sort of working on these stories of my family history. And that again, strangely enough, ties it back to Wajid Ali Shah, because it's more or less the same time frame and more or less the same period that I'm looking at.
Right. So where is it happening and when?
So that's happening in Dum Dum. That is happening on the 27th of December. So right now it's still in the preparatory stage and in sort of like the last leg of it. So it's called Everybody Has Moved, and it has a Bangla title called Bipodjanok Bari. Because yeah, like both ways I felt that.
Thank you so much, Shomo, for
Thank you,
joining us
Subhadrika.
on Indulge Videos, and we will be back soon with another episode. Thank you.